Hello, friends. Today I wanted to talk about a subject that is rather near and dear to my heart, which is humor in storytelling, particularly in books. And I'm not very happy about this sweater turtleneck situation I'm wearing. I feel like someone's aunt, but it is very, very cold today. So I'm going to be filming 2 videos, and they're going to be in my dowdy sweater outfit because just cannot get warm in here. I've mentioned before on this channel how I've wanted to be a writer as far back as I can remember, but actually the first thing I think I ever said I wanted to be was a stand-up comedian. That was before I realized that stand-up comedians have to actually stand up in front of people and do comedy. That is, I thought of it more like performing a pre-existing comedy routine from a Steve Martin record for an enduring audience of my relatives. And as soon as I realized it was actually coming up with your own witty observations or hilarious stories about your own life and traumas and having to perform them in front of strangers and deal with hecklers and stuff, my dreams of being a stand-up comedian immediately vanished forever. Nevertheless, I really, really love comedic writing. And a lot of my stories that, if you're reading my Hidden Lands books, they originated less in stories themselves, but in pretend games with my sister when we were kids. And that very first incarnation was more like we were just a hilarious improv troupe. And I remember when the show Third Rock from the Sun was on TV. Third Rock from the Sun was a show about aliens coming to Earth and taking human forms and trying to assimilate and understand American culture.
What is with all the computers in here?
Hasn't anybody heard of an abacus?
We both were like, oh, the vibe of this is exactly how our pretend games are. So they were not that serious. We were not serious children. We were much better at comedy pretend games than serious ones. And even nowadays when I'm writing, often if I'm trying to deal with kind of an incidental situation, I have to introduce a new character and they have a plot purpose, but I'm not sure what to do with this character. Instead of asking what would be the most conflict or the most thematic growth or whatever, the first thing my brain goes to is what would be the funniest thing to put here. But I don't really, I wouldn't really call my books predominantly comedy. I mean, some of them aren't funny at all, but even the ones that lean funny, they're not what you would call humorous first and foremost. We're not talking Terry Pratchett here or anything like that. My mixture of comedic sensibility and serious, sometimes very serious matters coexisting in one story is really most often found in anime and manga more than in Western storytelling for some reason. Although you certainly do find it. For some reason, it's more common in visual mediums. I would say something like the Marvel movies or Star Wars. A lot of these big blockbuster properties have that mix of some humorous moments and some really serious moments. Books don't have that as often for some reason. This is something I want to talk about. I don't have a conclusion, but I want to talk about why is that, and also just comedic, some tips, I guess. One of the funny things about writing a book that's comedic is I always feel I have to say well, I don't really know. I don't know if it's funny to anybody. I don't know if it's actually good comedy. For some reason, something about comedy really brings out my sense of I don't know if I did this right. Whereas romance is kind of the same. People don't all find the same thing universally romantic, but for some reason I don't feel as awkward saying this book is a romance. But when it comes to comedy, I feel really awkward being this book is comedic because I feel you might not think it's funny, but it's kind of dumb. Somebody probably, I feel confident that some people find my books funny, even if it's not everyone, the same as with romance. So I don't know why that is. And really out of everything, manga, Western stuff, my favorite example probably of the vibe that I really want to achieve is Avatar: The Last Airbender, because that story had moments where it really got me emotionally and I really felt for the characters, but also sometimes it is just so, so funny. Like, laugh out loud funny. And the kind of funny that like occasionally would take me off guard a little bit, which I also feel like is important in something that's going to be really funny, is those moments where it's like, I did not even expect that. One of my favorite moments is just when they meet the swamp benders, and there's just like this quick cut of the swamp bender and his like airboat just kind of like looking like a Florida man. In silence, but I didn't expect it, so it just like hit me as being so funny. But wait, Lydia, you might say, a lot of what you're talking about are visual mediums. They are not the same as books. Books are just harder to be funny in, maybe. Is that true? That's what I wonder. Are books not funny because it's harder for books to be funny, or are books not funny because they're just like a lot of writers aren't funny, or is it just the way we approach books like culturally? And that I really don't know, but it is something that I think about a lot, because one of the main reasons that I will put down a book is if it is not just not funny. I don't need every book to be funny, but it's almost like it exists in a void in which the entire concept of humor could not possibly exist in this world. And what I mean by that is you'll have a book where something about the premise is inherently both serious but also a little bit hilarious.
You better hold on tight, spider monkey.
Like a teenage girl falling in love with a 1,000-year-old fairy. That is a serious matter, and it is also rife with comedic possibility, rife with chances for misunderstanding and things to go wrong in hilarious fashion. And I don't necessarily need every book with this trope to be actively funny, but some of them take this premise so dead seriously that it's one of the things that makes me personally DNF a book pretty frequently, because a book doesn't have to be hilarious, but it does have to at least like very vaguely acknowledge the fact that humor exists for me to want to keep reading it. Clearly this is not true for everybody, because a lot of these deadly serious books that I have not finished are like bestsellers, so I have high demands, I guess. When I was looking at my bookshelf, a lot of the books that I would call humorous fall into one of several different categories, none of which is really what I write. There is some literary fiction, or at least books you would find in the literary fiction section, that are categorized as humor, and I don't usually like those very much. There's not enough humor, but there's also too much humor for me personally. I tend to kind of bounce off a book where it's like the whole premise is so comedic that I don't believe that any of this is real. Like, I need my humor grounded in some kind of reality, even, and that's a kind of difficult thing to explain, because everybody has their own things that pull them out of reality, and they're not going to be the same for everybody. But like, I love the show What We Do in the Shadows, and I would not say that anything about that show is really very realistic. So like, why does that one work for me, whereas a book that's classified as purely comedic doesn't? I don't know. We don't have to explain everything here. But you have your comedic fantasy, where the entire premise of the book is like kind of inherently comedic. It's not meant to be realistic exactly. Terry Pratchett is probably the most well-known author like that. As a teenager, I read a ton of like the Myth Adventures books. There were a lot of books like that floating around when I was a teenager in my like peak fantasy reading years, those kind of like humorous fantasy books. And they often kind of play a little bit with the real world as well. There'll be some kind of like riff on our modern culture or some kind of cross-cultural thing going on, which makes sense to me because I feel like it's much easier to be funny when you are in the modern world or you have a connection to the modern world. Like, it's much funnier to send a time traveler back to King Arthur's court than it is to just write about King Arthur's court. It's harder because you just have less cultural touchstones to kind of make jokes about. Extra bonus disheveled editing Lydia here today. Like, seriously, I very much just rolled out of bed. But I also wanted to note, one of the things that actually prompted this video is that I read 2 books in a row that were recommended to me as being funny. And one of them was actually laced with a very funny dialogue, very witty, few laugh out loud moments. The problem with this one is that it was so aggressively funny and witty, and also all the situations in the book were like so zany and off the wall that I was losing track of what was actually happening in the story and who the characters were, because it was like a dish that was overly spiced. It was too much both zaniness and wittiness. It was all the things at once, and that was just too much for me. And then the other one was not funny at all. It was the kind of book that I've noticed kind of hitting with the cozy fantasy trend that has sort of a humorous premise. And there have been a lot of these now that have, kind of premises along the lines of something like, I retired from villainhood, but now I need to get back into it to pay my tax bill. I don't know. That is a terrible example. I just rolled out of bed. But, they have some kind of premise that's kind of inherently oh, that's kind of funny. And then, the actual writing is not witty or funny at all. It's just oh, if I just make the situation funny, it will automatically be funny. And I feel like that is not the case. I expect the actual writing to have, comedic timing and wit laced within it, and both these authors I'm sure are selling better than me, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But I'm frustrated with the lack of just good humor in books that are also have real relatable characters and have some emotion in them at the same time. Rom-coms have calm in the name, but a lot of them are not that funny. They're more the premise has an inherently kind of humorous misunderstanding / the heroine might be a bit hapless, a bit stuck. There might be something a bit just kind of silly in the premise of the book, but the actual writing may or may not really be funny depending on the writer. It's not a necessity, I would say, in rom-com to actually be a good comedy writer. You really just need to kind of come up with a lighthearted premise. A lot of times I think the rom-com, the com really means lighthearted more so than comedic. And on a similar note, I've also noticed people referring to comedic fantasy as cozy fantasy, even when traumatic things happen in them, suggesting to me that there's a lot of overlap in people's brains between comedy and coziness. So you can have a book that's full of people getting murdered, but if it's funny, then it might be called cozy fantasy. So there's some interesting mental mishmash going on between comedy and lightheartedness and coziness. You have books that are witty, of which Jane Austen, of course, is kind of the original master. In the 1930s, there was a real boom. Cold Comfort Farm is only one of several on my shelf in this category, including Nancy Mitford, Dorothy Sayers. I've been meaning to get around to reading Wodehouse, but I have not read him yet, but I think he's definitely in that category. So there's a lot of them. Very kind of this very British humor that pokes fun at human nature. The very first line of Cold Comfort Farm is, "The education bestowed on Flora Post by her parents had been expensive, athletic, and prolonged." This is not laugh out loud funny, at least probably not to most people, but it is has a mild level of wit throughout the entire book, which I would say Jane Austen also kind of had those just witty observations on human nature. But I rarely find them in American literature compared to British, which might be what I'm reading. Just doesn't have it as much, but it seems like a very British kind of humor. Then you have satire and darker, drier literary humor, like Mrs. Bridge, a favorite of mine. This book I find hilarious, but it is very satirical and rather laced with a bit of darkness, kind of making fun at the shallowness of suburban life. throughout the book. Probably my favorite humorous writer, as she is also my favorite writer in general, is Ellen Montgomery, because she had that talent that Jane Austen had of making humorous observations about human nature. But she doesn't let it get as bogged down in the humor and wit to the point where the emotion gets lost. Like, her books hit me very hard emotionally at times, and I really love and feel for the characters, and the whole world feels very real. But at the same time, there are some lines in her books that are very funny. And that's kind of the balance I personally would love to strike. That while I love books like Stella Gibbons novels, they are a little too witty to be my favorite books of all time, because I just don't feel as deeply for the characters in these types of books when the wit is kind of on every page. In all honesty, I probably write a little more like Beverly Cleary, whose prose was so simple, and I really always felt for Ramona, but at the same time, she just had a really good way of like making her characters real in a hilarious way. In the very first chapter of Ramona the Pest, the very first Ramona book, the teacher is reading aloud Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel to the class. And Ramona raises her hand, and her teacher says, "I like the way Ramona remembers to raise her hand when she has something to say." "Yes, Ramona?" Ramona's hope soared. Her teacher had smiled at her. "Miss Binney, I want to know, how did Mike Mulligan go to the bathroom when he was digging the basement of the town hall?" Miss Binney's smile seemed to last longer than smiles usually last. Ramona glanced uneasily around and saw that others were waiting with interest for the answer. Everybody wanted to know how Mike Mulligan went to the bathroom. While this is in the category kind of kids say the darndest things, you know what? Adults also say and think and do the darndest things. We don't really grow out of that. And my writing probably owes a little something to just the simple humor of just people being people. This moment is so relatable, totally something a kid would ask. All the kids wanting to know, very, very believable, but it's also funny. I wanted to also note that something I really appreciate about this quick little bit is the setup, too, of the teacher praising Ramona. And it looks like it's going to be this great moment for her. And then she unwittingly wrecks her teacher's confidence in her by asking a question that just isn't quite appropriate for the 1950s classroom. And it's the setup and payoff that Beverly Cleary was just very good at. I do think it is easier to be funny in a visual medium because you have a different kind of timing you can access in a visual medium that in writing you have to kind of set up differently. So there's certain manga that I find very funny and have this great balance of humor and like the real life stuff. Like the Golden Kamuy manga is this mixture of like characters that feel real history of characters that I really feel for, real history, some very dramatic situations that like have my heart beating fast, but it also has like some extremely ridiculous, goofy stuff in it. And like, it's almost crazy that this works as well as it does. And in a book, I don't know how you could possibly write a novelization of Golden Kamuy and capture that seesawing of humor and drama and like cooking manga type moments that it has. I don't even know how you would possibly do that.
なんかまぶたがくっついて離れない。
あ、大変だ。白石。あ、ちょっと来い。おしっこかけてくれ。おしっこ出るか。白石。
ちょ、やめろ。おい、やめろ。
I envy visual mediums. They have access to some humor that writers don't have, but you know, writers also have certain abilities to get in people's heads with humor, and I would love to see more books make use of that. So now I'm going to talk about a few things that I do, a few techniques that I employ to make books funny. And again, my my main desire with a book is not the humor. It's really just to relate to the characters and care about their story. The emotional weight is more important to me than the humor. But to me, having good humorous moments gives the emotional parts more weight. And that might just be me. But if you agree with me and you would love to write more humor in your books, these are my best tips for how to increase humor in books. And I wish I knew what I meant with the note that says humor equals payoff / TikTok. But what did I mean by that? So one thing that just makes books funny are characters with an inherent contrast to one another. Your classic, odd couples and things like that. Two characters that are both perhaps likable but have extremely different outlooks on life that make them clash in ways that are funny. Characters that can challenge each other's perceptions and points of view in humorous ways. Like my character Det, I've written about him for a very long time. He's like the oldest character in my stories. And he, in a lot of ways, is your very classic, like, broody, tragic pasty, arrogant, powerful. His only sense of humor is a dry wit with like a smirk. He's the kind of guy that would be like the lead in a romantasy book, and he's like a 200-year-old fairy with pale hair and a bunch of powers, and he could totally be that kind of guy. But I've always thrown him in with characters that are total goofballs and like forced him to live with them instead of giving him a love interest and making him like a hot young looking guy. I've usually written him in his older age and written him more as like the dad who doesn't understand why his son is such a big dork. And even the romance that he does have in the books, his wife is kind of a goofball. And to me, Det is endearing because of the ridiculous characters that surround him. I would find Det pretty insufferable if he was just on his own being arrogant. And that's why I don't end up reading a lot of those books with the super serious, powerful, immortal love interest. Another example of this is the Dormangara-Kessely relationship. Dormangara is he's kind of the death god of the story, and he's kind of a shadow daddy trope. But I pair him with a girl who's just like one of my readers described her as like just a regular like cheeseburger kind of gal or something like that. And I've always imagined her in like a sports jersey that does not exist in the fantasy world. But like, I see her as that kind of girl who's like faithfully attended the home team baseball game with her family, and her dad's like a welder, like a union man welder, and they're really loud. That's how I imagine her family vibes. So the contrast of those two, pairing the shadow daddy with someone like Kessely, is inherently kind of funny. Minor characters can be, in my mind, a little closer to a caricature. They're not going to last on the page for very long. So much like in real life, I find in real life, that's where I encounter people that are like, how is that person even real? I probably am not going to like enter a long-lasting friendship or other relationship with that person unless they unfortunately end up being a coworker. But you'll encounter people sometimes where it's like, wow, this person is so outside of my normal wheelhouse of person that I don't even understand them. But at the same time, they're kind of hilarious for all of that. In my book, Wanted, Brooding Man, Tragic Past, there is a character who has this like accent that's like almost incomprehensible, but he keeps telling stories. And that was based on a guy I ran into at the local bar who started telling us a story, and his mountain accent was so thick that I could barely understand a word he was saying. And he's like this old guy. And of course, he's telling this kind of story that I just, for what I could comprehend, it was also completely unrelatable to me. But he is I put a little bit of that energy into the character of Lucky in Wanted, Brooding Man. Good humor, I think, often has a mixture of the familiar, something that feels like a situation that you have encountered yourself in your life, but is also very specific. The Ramona Mike Mulligan and the steam shovel is a good example. That feels like something that you probably already, like you can believe that moment has already happened to you at some point in your life, but it also probably hasn't, not exactly like that. and having the detail of this very specific book, this very specific moment, and all the kids wanting to know, how does Mike Mulligan go to the bathroom, is a good mix of the familiar and the specific that often makes for some good humor. And it's another reason why it can be very hard to write humor when you don't have access to modern cultural touchstones. So if you have read my Hidden Lands books, you might notice that there is less humor in the older timeline books where they don't really have a lot of modern culture yet, and it feels more like a epic fantasy world. The more the world modernizes, the funnier the books get because there's more modern culture that we can relate to that I can kind of riff off of with my humor. So along with having characters that are very different from each other, you can also put characters in very fish out of water situations, and that can be very funny. So if you have a character who's always lived in the lap of luxury and you suddenly throw them into, you know, a country hoedown, like that's going to be inherently funny. That is something that a good rom-com often does well, is throwing characters in those fish out of water situations. And there's kind of an escalation pattern to good humor a lot of times, where you'll kind of set up a situation that's initially a little bit funny and then you'll escalate it later to being even more funny. If I have a situation that starts off a little bit humorous, this is often how I perk up those kind of like somewhat incidental, just like a character that I need in the book, but I don't really know what to do with them. I'll also do that with a situation where like this needs to happen, but at the same time, how do I make it interesting? And a lot of times the answer for me is humor. If I have a scene where, you know, I need the characters to get from point A to point B and I'm not sure how to make that interesting, I'll just throw something kind of funny in there. Sometimes there'll naturally be an escalation of that joke that will kind of play out through the book. And that can happen both with situations and just with little individual jokes. I'm currently working on the sequel to The Potion Dealers, and I know that the gang needs to find a new place to live. At the end of The Potion Dealers, Alfred's father has disowned him and he can't afford his nice apartment anymore. So we know he has to find a new place to live, and they all have to find this new place to live. But it's like, how do I make that scene, which isn't going to have any kind of real inherent tension, probably not some big character growth moment or anything like that. How do I make this scene interesting? So I made it humorous. Alfred's like realtor calls him at a time when he's the only one available to see a house, and she's like, this house is a fantastic deal, you have to jump on it immediately. But Alfred is blind, so he doesn't really want to go look at the house all by himself. He wants to make sure that like at least somebody who can see has vetted the place to make sure. But there's no time for that. So he goes, and he goes in with very much with the knowledge that like my realtor could possibly be trying to foist a really ugly house on me. So he's being very careful and cautious and asking her a lot of questions about the house. By the time he's done reviewing this dwelling, it is absolutely clear to him that this house is a fantastic deal. She's not wrong about that. It has everything pretty much on their wish list. It's like, he gets it. He's got to go for this house, but he also knows there's got to be something about this house that's like hideous. So there's a little bit of inherent humor just in Alfred trying to grill his realtor about like what is wrong with this place. But we also know that it could get funnier when everybody else sees the house. When everybody else gets a look at the house is like owned by these artistic people who gave it like hilarious wallpaper and wall paintings. It also has a magical oven that talks to you. And Alfred thinks this is a fascinating feature, but when it comes to actually using the oven later on, that just becomes like funny. Like imagine if you had an oven that talks and takes directions and like operates magically, but the oven itself is like 200 years old. So like its idea of what like cooking even isn't very up to date. And after that, I was able to keep having little jokes about the house and interactions with the oven and stuff repeat throughout the book. And as you repeat jokes or like call back to jokes, I think audiences also like that because it's kind of like when you have an in-joke with a friend, you start to feel like you're kind of in on it, like you're part of the club and you're hanging out with a friend because you remember the joke and you get that the joke is now escalating. Like, this isn't something that a new reader would get. This is something that the faithful reader would get. Another thing that can be inherently funny is giving a character a mixture of getting the upper hand and then losing it and being, like, humiliated. In, like, action scenes, I tend to get a little bored with action scenes. I'm not, like, a big action scene person, but if I make them a little bit humorous, then I'm more invested in them personally. So a lot of times what I'll do is kind of give the character a back and forth between moments where they do something cool, they get a good, they get a win, and a moment where they just kind of fall flat and, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically, but they get humiliated or something just botches, does not go like they planned. That's another way that you can kind of like inject humor into a serious situation. And you can like scale it up and down depending on how funny you want a book to be. Oh, and one other thing that can be funny is just throwing in something that is unexpectedly real and relatable into a scene. Like if you have a scene that's kind of, you do have a book that's kind of dramatic and serious, but you want to just inject a tiny bit of levity into a moment. You can just have something a little bit really relatable happen in there. Like having a pet in the book is good for this. If you have a moment that's really serious and then all of a sudden just a pet does a goofy pet thing, then that's a way to just throw a little bit of humor into a book that is otherwise rather serious. So like The Broken Queen is a pretty serious book, but it has some moments like this where something just very relatable happens, and that kind of keeps it hopefully from being completely heavy. So those are my thoughts on humor in books and how I would love to see more little tidbits of humor in books in general. And I would also love to know, what is your favorite book that you find funny? It doesn't have to be like funny all the way through, uproariously funny, like a humorous book. It could be like Anne of Green Gables level of humor, where there's just a low-key inherent human nature kind of humor to it. Or it could be dark humor. It could be anything. And if you have any thoughts or tips about humor in books in general, I would also love to know those. If you're new here, my name is Lydia Foxglove, and I'm a fantasy author, and I have been a full-time author since 2009, both traditionally and indie published, and my channel is about the creative life in general and the writing life in particular. So if that sounds good to you, I hope you'll stick around. If you'd like more from me, my members get 2 bonus videos a month, as well as access to my Discord server where we chat about writing and all kinds of other stuff. You can access my memberships through YouTube, Patreon, or Substack, and I also sometimes send out free newsletters through Patreon and Substack, just chatting about whatever. If you'd like to read any of my books, the Hidden Lands books are the ones that I always recommend first, of which probably the most humorous ones are either Wanted Brooding Man, Tragic Past, or The Potion Dealers, depending on what kind of vibe you want. I also have a free book of the month. I had the wrong book mentioned when I originally recorded this video, but it is Captain Hook and the Mermaid, a spicy fairy tale retelling. Thank you so much for watching. I post every Sunday and sometimes on Wednesdays, and I will see you next time. Bye!